And let me just offer a brief introduction. It's so nice to have Dr. Kimberly Doell presenting. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Consumer Decision and Sustainable Behavior Lab at the University of Geneva, Switzerland. I should note it's, I believe, almost 10 p.m. there. So thanks so much, Kim, for staying up late with us and being willing to share. Dr. Doell's research broadly combines components of social cognition, reward processing, and sustainable decision-making with the overarching goal of investigating and promoting pro-social and pro-environmental behaviors. Today, she'll be talking with us about using experience sampling to measure and even promote various pro-environmental behaviors. Her talk is entitled Environmental Trait Affect Predicts Real-Time Environmental Behavior and Sensitivity to Emotional and Environmental Messages. She had a couple of contributors listed, Beatrice Conti, PhD candidate at the University of Geneva, as well as Tobias Broche, a professor there as well. So thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Doell. Again, we'll have time for the presentation and maybe a few extra minutes if we need it. For those who have questions, we certainly invite you to submit those through the Q&A option there at the bottom of your screen. So we'll hand it over to you now, Kim.
Perfect. Thank you, Tim, so much for that introduction. And indeed, it is almost 10 o'clock here in Switzerland, so please forgive me if I seem a little bit tired. It's been a bit of a long day, especially with such a number of wonderful presentations that we got to listen to. So let's get to it. Today I'll be presenting some of our work from here in Geneva. The overarching title is Environmental Trait Affect Predicts Real-Life Environmental Behaviors. So I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail about the whole climate crisis or the big motivation for why I believe we need these kinds of studies. Instead, I'm going to talk mainly about what exactly environmentally relevant behaviors are in the context that we measured them inside of these experiments and why we decided to use experience sampling. Then I'm going to be talking about the methods, the results, and some conclusions across two different studies that we ran, and finally kind of some overarching take-home messages. So let's get to it. So at the Decision Lab in Geneva, one of our kind of overarching goals is to try to understand how and why do people engage in different types of environmentally relevant behaviors, or what I like to call ERBs. So these are actions that humans engage in which can have either a positive or negative impact on kind of the natural world. So we have basically broken up various behaviors into three main categories. So the first one you obviously know are positive ERBs, also known as pro-environmental behaviors, and includes things such as recycling. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we also have behaviors that have a specific negative impact on the natural world. This includes, for example, taking your trash and burning it, or throwing away things that could otherwise be recycled or could otherwise still be useful. And kind of in the middle, we have things that are not really that environmentally relevant, such as sleeping. They don't have a huge impact on the natural world. So we wanted to kind of understand what would motivate somebody to engage in, for example, a positive ERB, when usually it's often much easier to just engage in a negative ERB. So imagine if you have something that you want to recycle. Normally you have to go to find the correct recycling bin, figure out which one to put it in. Normally it's just much easier to pretty much throw it on the ground or throw it into the trash. So why would somebody want to specifically engage in this behavior versus this behavior? For me personally right now, I would like to engage in this behavior. So unfortunately, these types of behaviors are relatively complicated and they don't always translate well into kind of a laboratory-based setting. So imagine trying to pass an ethics proposal, for example, where you want to bring participants into the lab and give them the choice between recycling something or burning something. It's probably not going to work. So instead, we turned to experience sampling. Specifically, we developed what we call the ERB assessment protocol. So several times per day, participants would receive a text message on their personal phone. Then we would ask them, within the last hour, did you commit or witness an environmentally relevant behavior? And beforehand, we had trained our participants to understand what we meant by witness. So this included either I saw somebody else do something firsthand, somebody told me about something, or I learned about something, for example, online. So following this question, they had 5 different options that they could choose from. Yes, I committed something positive or negative. Yes, I witnessed something positive or negative. Or no, I did not commit an environmental behavior. In which case we asked them to think about another non-environmental behavior and report about that one instead. On the next page, we then asked them to briefly describe their action that they were thinking about, and then simply to rate their mood in terms of valence, basically from very negative to very positive or neutral. So variations of this protocol were used across both of the experiments that I'll present today. But utilizing this technique allowed us to kind of capture more naturalistic observations of environmental behaviors in the wild. So study 1, we had 3 main predictors or psychological constructs that we thought would have the greatest impact on real-world ERB commission in this context. The first 2 came from the short to the STEG value scales. So if you don't know, values are kind of motivational constructs that determine what is important to us throughout our life. So they act as kind of like a roadmap to help us make different types of decisions. So for example, someone who's highly egoistically motivated tends to consider how their decisions will impact themselves, while somebody who's highly biosphere oriented will think about how their actions influence the environment. The other main predictor that we had came from the Environmental Trait Affect Questionnaire, which was developed here at the University of Geneva. And in particular, we were interested in this kind of positive outcome affect. So what we're starting to call environmental warm glow. So somebody who's very high on positive outcome affect tends to feel a lot of positive emotions in situations towards environmental behaviors with positive outcomes. So for example, if I feel very high, or if I feel a lot of pride when I engage in a pro-environmental behavior myself, or if I feel a lot of positive affect when I see somebody else engage in a pro-environmental behavior, then I would score quite high on this scale. So part of the reason why we're calling it this warm glow feeling or dispositional warm glow is because what ends up happening is that you kind of have almost this rewarding experience. And it's thought to be that this warm glow is one of the contributing factors to why somebody would engage in, for example, altruistic behaviors. So overall, in study 1, we had 2 main research questions. The first one was, can we actually utilize experience sampling in this context in order to measure real-world environmental behaviors? And the second one was to understand how these values and trait affect influence mainly positive environmental behaviors. I say positive here because I don't have a lot of time to talk about the negative, and I think that overall, most of us could use a little bit more positivity these days. So I decided to just focus on those. The design looked like this. On day 0, all participants were recruited online and then filled in a series of online questionnaires, including the environmental trait affects questionnaire, our different value scales. We also gave them social desirability scales, different types of demographics, etc. And then we guided them on how to register for the app that we were using. And then for the next 10 days, we asked our participants 5 times per day to engage in the ERB assessment protocol. So overall, this was quite a hefty experiment that our participants had to engage in, but we were very pleasantly surprised with the results. So overall, we had 181 participants engage in this, almost internationally, from the US, the UK, Switzerland, etc. And an impressive 84% response rate overall. So we were very, very happy. And when we look at the frequency of the different types of behaviors, we can see this kind of nice U-shaped pattern where we had almost as many non-environmental behaviors reported as committed positive, half as many committed negative, and around 10% in total of witnessed. But for me, the best part was actually to be able to read what participants were actually writing. So for committed positive environmental behaviors, they would say things like, I used a refillable water bottle, I bought a solar panel for my house, or my personal favorite, I got an ice cream in a cone instead of a cup. Clearly, this person is helping to save the planet. For committed negative, participants would report things like, I used a plastic bag for garbage, or I was burning wood. Witness positive included things like, I saw somebody driving a Tesla. Witness negative included things like Trump tweeting certain things or seeing other people do certain activities. And finally, non-environmental behaviors included things like, I read a book or I was sleeping. So overall, we have a very nice data set, which includes a huge variability in terms of not only environmental impact, but also creativity regarding different types of environmental behaviors. So Now let's see how reporting these type of behaviors actually influence participants' mood. So we took all of this data, went through it into basically a huge multi-level regression model, and the results are shown here. So if you haven't seen this kind of graph before, bear with me. Basically, these are the regression coefficients that are shown here, and we have our 4 main predictors here, or 4 different behaviors, and all of these were predicting mood. So we can see that the valence of the reported behavior greatly affected mood, such that if I reported committing a positive ERB or witnessing a positive ERB, had an overall increase in subsequent mood. Committed negative behaviors, or especially witnessed negative behaviors, resulted in an overall decrease in mood. So this kind of makes sense, right? And it's also congruent, positive with positive and negative with negative. But we were also interested in understanding how positive outcome affect, or this warm glow, interacted with particularly committed positive ERBs as well as witness positive. And here is the results from the interaction. We have the exact same interaction for witness positive and committed positive, so I just showed the one here. But basically, as participants increased on the amount of positive outcome affect they experienced as a trait, whenever they reported committing a positive ERB, they actually had a larger increase in their mood compared to committing any other type of behavior. So this makes sense, right? The more likely I am to feel good about engaging in a certain behavior, the more likely I am to have a boost in my mood. So it's kind of this almost internal validation for positive outcome affect and understanding exactly what we are measuring here. So next, we wanted to look at the psychological processes predicting pro-environmental behaviors. And the first thing that we noticed here is that in actuality, we were quite surprised because biospheric values and egoistic values didn't really contribute overall to the model. Neither of these were significant. But indeed, again, positive outcome affect was. So the more positive emotions I experienced, trait-wise, when engaging in positive behaviors, the more likely I am to then report at least engaging in pro-environmental behaviors. And again, this is related to this idea of warm glow, which I feel like I am repeating many times here. But again, if I feel really good about engaging in a positive behavior, I'm going to engage in more positive behaviors. So overall from study 1, we can say that experience sampling allowed us to measure a diverse set of real-world environmental behaviors. The valence of the behavior, positive or negative, influenced mood congruently, and trait-positive outcome affect influenced mood following positive ERBs, positively associated with committed positive ERBs, and kind of seems to result in this almost vicious cycle of feeling good and doing good, but for the planet. So in study 2, we wanted to investigate this in a more causal fashion because previously this study was, not previously, in actuality, this study was mainly just correlational, but we wanted to see if we could actually influence this somehow in order to be able to make more solid claims. Now, unfortunately, targeting someone's positive trait affect is not very easy to do, although we are planning to try. Instead, what we decided to do was manipulate emotions in the morning and see how that resulted in a change to behavior as a function of positive outcome affect. So in study 2, again, we had 2 overarching research questions. The first one was, can we use experience sampling to actually influence ERBs this time? The second one was to understand if positive outcome affect influences ERB commission situationally, which I will explain more in just a second. So again, we gave our participants the set of online questionnaires on day 0. And then from the next day, they started with an intervention message. And this was delivered in the morning. So they received a new style information, and which I will explain also in a moment. And then we asked them to rate different emotions that they felt as a result of reading this information. Following the intervention, 3 times throughout the rest of the day, they then had the ERB assessment protocol. And this time we gave this to our participants for only 3 days. So we reduced it from 10. So this was actually a between study. So we broke our news information into 3 different groups. In the positive environmental group, we told participants about, for example, massive tree planting efforts and how that was going to help with reducing climate change. We gave, for the negative environmental group, we said things like, okay, there's a huge oil spill off of the Gulf of Mexico. And then we had also this kind of control group or non-environmental group where we told them things that were relatively neutral, such as scientists have some new information about what snakes are eating. So basically, we wanted to systematically manipulate environmental emotions here and then see how that influenced E or B commission. So this time we ended up with slightly more American participants than in the first study and just a little bit lower of response rate overall, but still pretty good. But when we look at the spread of the actual behaviors, we can see that we have this nice U shape. I should also mention, by the way, I have up here the schematic for which part of the analysis that we're actually looking at, because this design is a little bit complicated, as well as the color coding for the different groups. So for the ERBs, we can see again that we have around as many committed positive as non-environmental behaviors. On average, they tended to report the same kinds of things like recycling, throwing trash on the ground, seeing other people do things, etc. So what about the emotions induced in the morning? So I'm going to kind of go a little bit quickly here, but when we look at the interaction between trait positive outcome affect and group predicting average positively valenced emotions experienced just after reading the news information, we see these very interesting results. So if we take the non-environmental group here as kind of a reference point, we can say that as people increased on this trait positive outcome affect, if they received positive environmental news, they had a greater increase in the amount of positively valenced emotions they experienced from reading that news. And if they were given negative environmental news, they had an overall decrease. So trait positive outcome affect influences the emotional reactance to this environmental information differently depending on the content of this information. So far, so good. Finally, when we put all of this together in kind of the crescendo of these experiments, we looked at the interaction between trait positive outcome affect and group again, but this time predicting the likelihood to commit reporting a positive environmental behavior. And I just broke up the interactions into two different ones so that we can see it just a little bit better. But basically what we can say here is that compared to, so this time the reference point we're looking at is the positive environmental group. Compared to the positive environmental group, we see that receiving this information, the negative information or the non-environmental information did indeed change behavior because both of these are actually significant. So overall, we can say that trait positive outcome affect also influences E or B commission depending on the context as well. But we were actually relatively surprised to see the interaction looking this way. We had expected to see this side, but we had not expected to see this side. So we ran an additional analysis, which is called the Johnson-Newman analysis, just to be able to understand where the slopes of these two lines were actually significantly different from each other. And from this analysis, we found this interval in the middle of non-significance. So in here, these two lines were not significant. So if you're kind of medium, let's say, on trait positive outcome affect, receiving this environmental news didn't really overall influence your behaviors. But on the right, if you're very high on trait positive outcome affect, receiving positive environmental news resulted in an overall increase in the number of positive environmental behaviors that you actually reported. But for me, what's even kind of more somehow interesting and shocking is what's going on over here on the left. So if you are very low on trait positive outcome affect, and keep in mind that relatively few of our participants actually were, which is why we see such large error bars over here. But still, if you were one of the few participants that was very, very low on this scale, what actually happened was if you received positive environmental information in the morning, this information almost backfired and resulted in you engaging in fewer environmental behaviors throughout the rest of the day. So this has some quite substantial implications for just reading or learning about different types of environmental behaviors in kind of the real world, right? And we see also a very similar pattern over when we compare positive versus non-negative environmental groups as well. So let's put everything together. Overall, what we can say is that experience sampling definitely allowed us to measure a variety of environmental behaviors and to test our first intervention in a real world setting. Trait positive outcome affect influences mood following positive ERB commission as well as witnessing. Sensitivity to environmental information, and finally, the likelihood to engage in positive ERBs across both of our studies. So overarching, the kind of big take-home message is that intrinsic motivations, such as positive environmental information, may be a salient way to promote pro-environmentality kind of in the real world. But from study 2, we can also say that we should kind of be aware of the possibility of these backfiring effects. My take-home message for you is, go back. My take-home message for you is to please remember to feel good, especially when you engage in pro-environmental behaviors, because you can actually help to save the environment. Thank you very much for paying attention to me. As well, thank you to the 2 collaborators that we have on this project, the plethora of students that helped to recruit these participants and run these analyses. And thank you very much to you for paying attention. Are there any questions?
Well, thanks so much, Kim, for that interesting presentation. And really, I learned a lot. I know much less, well, very little about this area, so it was very informative. Couple questions here as we get started. The first one says interesting behavior to predict. Any thoughts on how social desirability bias may be influencing the results? For example, people being less likely to admit they're burning their trash, for example.
Yes, so that is actually a quite common question that I get. And one of the things that we are attempting to highlight in the paper is actually that very often in these kinds of experience sampling, I don't know about the other researchers, but we did have an impact of social desirability in a number of the regression analyses. Interestingly, not in the negative environmental regressions, but in the positive ones. So there was some component, at least, of people reporting kind of what they wanted to. But in light of the interaction with the mood, this also kind of makes sense, right? If people are reporting negative environmental behaviors, it's kind of like they're telling on themselves, and then they have a subsequent kind of overall drop in their mood. So this is kind of one of the drawbacks, I guess, as most researchers know about using this technique, is that it's also not so easy to be able to understand or kind of police our participants to know exactly what they were, how they were actually behaving in the real world. So yeah, social desirability definitely played a role in some spots.
Sure. I may have missed this. Did you find any changes over time with your participants? So as you were measuring them, in terms of those behaviors, did you see any trends that way?
So interestingly, not a lot. I expected, so the reason why we originally said, okay, let's give it to them for 10 days, because it was our kind of our first more or less piloting experience sampling. We decided to give it for 10 days so that we could actually calculate more or less where participants would be like, okay, that's it, I've had enough of this, and either start to report their real behaviors or to drop off on certain types of behaviors. But in actuality, we did not really find a large influence of time in our regression models. Pretty surprising, actually.
Yeah, very interesting. If I caught it correctly in study 1, it looked like you saw lower mood among participants who were observing others engaging in negative ERBs relative to them committing it themselves. Did I see that correctly?
Yes.
Yeah. So could you say a little more about that? I thought that was an interesting interesting finding, and what do you make of it?
Yes. So indeed, when I first saw this, I kind of chuckled to myself a little bit, because it's almost like, okay, so we have to keep in mind that the witness negative here are composed of multiple different actions, right? It's not just that I saw somebody else do something, but it's also that, for example, I heard about Trump doing something, or I saw my friend do something. So it's kind of a little bit of a mixed bag. But I kind of went into the data set just a little bit there, because I thought it was kind of quite an interesting result. And I found that the lowest drop in mood was when participants specifically saw somebody else, particularly close others, engaging in kind of bad behaviors. So it was almost like they had a drop in mood when they were telling on themselves, but even more so when they were kind of telling on other people. So this was kind of almost an anecdotal, interesting result that I thought was kind of a little bit funny.
Yeah, it struck me as well. Um, what you noted in that second study, um, just the potential backfire, I guess, as you said, when you are delivering this kind of information, and how it may um, lead individuals to actually be less thoughtful about how they're caring for the environment. Um, I guess the question I have, again, not knowing this area, but that trait positive outcome affect, what is shaping that, and to what extent is it malleable, so that we can potentially have more positive impacts?
So one of my future dream studies is to try to actually investigate that more specifically, trying to understand what are the specific factors. So we know that your values, particularly biospheric values, is linked to this trait positive outcome affect that you feel. It's also positively correlated with overall positive affect. So like if you measure from the PANAS scale, so it's kind of a combination of different things, I would think. But especially what I would like to understand is if we can actually specifically target it and somehow try to reinforce this good behavior, good feelings, good behavior, good feelings. Because if we can actually kickstart that vicious cycle that I was talking about earlier, maybe that would have an even better or an even overall better impact and try to actually kind of get rid of the relatively few participants that are over on this side of the graph, kind of eliminate the backfiring.
Okay. Yeah. Uh, Another question that came up: what if participants got both negative and positive in environmental news, either mixed or on alternating days? Any sense of what kind of effect this might have, or have you thought about um, considering? Have you considered that as an option?
Yeah, so originally we actually wanted to do a within study here. So 2 days of one, 2 days of the other, 2 days of the final one. But basically, what ended up happening was that we just really confused our participants. So they were like, I don't understand. Yesterday, I got this good information. Today, you're giving me this bad information. And even I think I had one or two participants wrote me kind of an angry email. I was like, I don't want to hear about this stuff. So in that case, we were like, okay, well, why don't we just try and keep it a little bit more uh, not clean, but just a little bit more of a streamlined, simple manipulation rather than trying to confabulate between the, yeah, mixing in between the different conditions.
Sure. Okay. Great. And then another question here: would you expect to find the same trends in your data for study two if it were to have a 1 or 2 week break in intervention and then repeat for a second burst, um, or do you think things might turn out differently?
The saliency kind of question. So indeed, part of the results from study two could be just that indeed, or okay, so part of the reason why we see such pronounced effects could be that because I mean, participants are being more or less bombarded with different types of environmental information throughout the day. So I don't know about you, but from news, from Twitter, social media, Facebook, etc., you get all of these different kind of inputs about good and bad things that are happening more or less on a regular basis, and not just for the environment, but across all types of news information. Especially right now, with a little bit more negative than I guess we're kind of used to. So in this context, there could be some sort of saliency effect that is resulting in overall the most amount of change in behavior, if we can call it change in behavior anyway. But it would be also interesting to see if we could actually track our participants over a few week period, given, okay, so here's some good environmental information, here's some good environmental information, maybe even here's some good environmental information. Feel good about it, feel good about it. Here's some more environmental information, feel good about it, feel good about it. And again, see if we can actually kind of reinforce this vicious cycle.
Mm-hmm. Great, great.
This is my hopeful dream experiment.
Sure. Well, it's been really nice to talk with you, Kim, and hear about this work. We certainly wish you the best as you pursue those goals.
Thank you
And
so much.
Yeah, and thanks again for staying up late with us there in Switzerland.
My
Um,
pleasure.
all right. Well,